I overheard my daughter saying to her friends, "My father is boring me. I have no privacy." That sentence still burns in my chest, but before that cruel moment, there was an ordinary evening where I sat in my living room, believing my life was whole, complete, and filled with respect. The clock ticked softly against the wall. The air carried the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea, and I leaned back into my armchair, feeling a rare sense of contentment. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The television hummed low in the background, but I was barely listening. Instead, letting my eyes drift toward the family photographs displayed on the mantel. Lily's face smiled back at me from every frame, a reminder of the years I had spent sacrificing so she could grow up with the comfort and opportunities I never had. In that quiet hour, I felt proud, convinced she looked up to me, convinced that behind her occasional mood swings of adolescence, she carried gratitude. The lamp beside me bathed the room in warm light, and I let myself imagine her future, how she might one day thank me for the long hours of work I had endured, the late nights when I returned home too tired to eat, yet still sat beside her while she studied. I thought of the piano lessons she once begged for, lessons I paid for with money I could barely spare, and I smiled, imagining she might recognize my love through those acts. My wife was upstairs folding laundry, humming a faint tune, and the house carried that peaceful, lived-in atmosphere of a home built on sacrifice and routine. I sipped my tea, the taste plain but comforting, and felt myself drifting into the kind of reflective silence only a parent truly knows. The day had been long at work, the meetings draining, but sitting here in this room made it worthwhile. I believed in that moment that Lily, despite her occasional eye rolls and complaints, respected me as her father, that she understood the weight of responsibility I carried for her sake. There was a simple joy in imagining her speaking kindly of me to her friends, perhaps even boasting about my hard work, about how I always provided even when times were difficult. The ordinary evening felt like proof of a life well built, a family foundation strong and secure. I had no reason to doubt it, no reason to suspect that my daughter's heart carried different words, harsher words, ones that would cut deeper than any insult I had ever received from a stranger. I remember adjusting the cushion beneath me, settling deeper into the chair, letting myself feel proud as if the universe had finally rewarded my quiet endurance. To me, in that stillness, nothing was wrong. My daughter was in her room upstairs, her soft laughter drifting faintly through the ceiling, and I assumed it was laughter rooted in joy, in a life of comfort, in a girl who loved her father. Little did I know the truth. The warmth of that evening shattered with a single careless whisper that was never meant for my ears, yet pierced me deeper than any dagger could. I had risen from my chair to take my empty cup to the kitchen when I paused at the foot of the stairs, hearing Lily's voice carrying faintly through the still air of the house. At first I smiled, thinking she was giggling with a friend about trivial things, the way teenagers often do, and for a brief second I was glad to hear her so animated, but then her words grew sharp, heavy with contempt, and they crashed against me before I had time to prepare. "My father is boring me. I have no privacy. I can't stand living here." I froze on the staircase, gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles whitened, and I felt the world tilt. Those words echoed again and again in my mind, each repetition like the breaking of glass inside my chest. Boring. No privacy. Can't stand living here. How could she say such things after all the nights I stayed awake worrying about her safety, after all the years I bled my youth into endless work just to give her a life without hunger or fear? I stood there in silence, listening to her laugh with her friends as though she had just told the most amusing joke, and the laughter was worse than the words themselves because it stripped me of dignity. I wanted to storm into her room, demand an explanation, shout until my voice thundered against her arrogance, but my feet refused to move. Instead, I remained still, my body heavy with betrayal, my mind racing through every memory I had carried with pride. The piano lessons, the school uniforms, the new phone she had begged for last year, all of them had been tokens of my love, yet in her eyes they amounted to nothing more than the suffocation of a boring man who gave her no privacy. In that instant, I felt like a stranger in my own home, as though the walls I had built no longer belonged to me. Her voice continued upstairs, casual, careless, as if mocking me from beyond the ceiling. I realized then that my daughter saw me not as her protector, not as her provider, but as an obstacle in her life, a burden she could not wait to escape. My heart pounded, my chest tightened, and I wondered if I had been blind all along, imagining respect where there was none. I staggered back from the staircase, careful not to make a sound, retreating like a wounded animal into the shadows of my own house. The evening that once felt ordinary had turned cruel, the peace replaced with a poison I could not swallow. I sat back in the chair, staring blankly at the wall, hearing her words over and over until they became a cruel refrain. Boring, no privacy, can't stand living here. I stood in the center of the living room, my body locked in place, unable to breathe as the sting of betrayal coursed through me like fire in my veins. The words I had overheard were not just casual complaints. They were knives twisted into the very core of my being, shredding the fragile illusions I had so carefully nurtured about my daughter's love and respect. My heart sank so violently that I could almost hear its weight hitting the floor, dragging down every proud memory I had ever held. All those years of sacrifice that I wore like invisible medals, the overtime shifts, the nights I walked home in the rain so she could have the taxi fare, the countless times I denied myself new clothes or even small comforts so she could walk into school without shame. All of it suddenly felt mocked, reduced to nothing more than background noise in her life. To her, I was boring, a man who suffocated her, a father whose presence was a burden rather than a blessing. The betrayal did not just wound me, it unmade me. I had always believed the bond between parent and child was sacred, forged through love, discipline, and care, but now I saw how fragile it truly was, how easily words spoken into a phone could unravel years of devotion. My chest tightened until it hurt to breathe, and I found myself trembling, not with anger but with something far worse, a hollow despair. I thought of the nights I carried her on my shoulders when she was too tired to walk, of the way her tiny hands once clutched mine as though I was her entire world. Those memories that had once been my source of strength now cut me deeper, because they reminded me of what had been lost, of how far she had drifted from that innocent child who once adored her father. My mind screamed that this was unfair, that I did not deserve such cruelty, but the pain was too raw for logic. I froze in silence, afraid that if I moved, the dam inside me would burst and I would collapse under the flood of grief. The house around me suddenly felt foreign, as though it no longer belonged to me, as though her words had stripped me of my place within it. I stared at the family photographs, at her smiling face immortalized in frames that mocked me now, and I wondered if those smiles had ever been real, or if they had always concealed this quiet contempt. Betrayal is not only about what is said, but what it reveals, and in that moment I saw that my daughter's heart held no reverence for the life I had built for her. I was not her hero. I was her jailer. And the knowledge sank into me with a heaviness that threatened to crush every part of who I believed I was. The sting of her words opened a floodgate of memories, and I found myself drowning in flashbacks of everything I had given up to make sure Lily's life was secure, comfortable, and full of opportunity. I remembered the first job I took when she was barely 2 years old, a job that demanded 12-hour shifts on my feet, where my back ached so badly at night that I could hardly lie down to sleep. Yet, I endured it because her baby formula and diapers were more important than my own comfort. I recalled the nights when the factory whistle blew at midnight, and I stayed on for the overtime shift, my eyes burning with exhaustion, just so her mother could buy her that red winter coat she had pointed at in the store window. There were moments when I wanted to pursue my own passions, when friends invited me to join their business ventures or travel with them, but I said no every time, telling myself that my daughter's needs came before my own dreams. I had once dreamed of opening a small workshop for carpentry, a craft I loved with all my soul. But the savings for that went instead to her tuition fees, ensuring she could attend the best schools and walk through clean hallways instead of crumbling classrooms. I remembered my shoes, worn down at the soles, patched and repatched because I could not justify spending on myself when Lily's piano lessons required another month's payment. My heart ached recalling how I would come home late at night, bones heavy, but still push open her bedroom door quietly to check if she was sleeping, kissing her forehead, before collapsing on the couch because I was too tired to climb into bed. The sacrifices were endless. The vacations I never took, the hobbies I abandoned, the friendships I allowed to fade because I had no time or money for gatherings. Every choice had been made with her in mind, every coin stretched to protect her from the struggles I had known as a child. I gave up my youth willingly, believing that her future would shine brighter because of it. I could still see her younger self beaming as she tore open the wrapping paper on her birthday gifts I worked double shifts to afford, and I thought then that her happiness made it all worth it. Yet now, in the shadow of her cruel whisper, those sacrifices replayed like cruel jokes, reminders that all my labor and devotion had been invisible to her. She had never seen the sweat, the aching hands, the dreams buried quietly in the back of my heart. To her, I was just a dull presence, a boring man who kept her from privacy. The memories that once gave me pride now mocked me, showing me how much of myself I had poured into her life, only to be repaid with contempt. The days that followed felt heavy, and though I tried to convince myself that perhaps I had misheard or exaggerated the sting of Lily's words, the truth soon revealed itself in ways that left no room for doubt. I began noticing little things, conversations cut short when I entered a room, laughter that shifted into whispers the moment I passed by, and the uneasy way her friends looked at me when they visited the house. One evening, as I lingered quietly near the hallway while Lily entertained her circle of friends in the living room, their voices reached me through the thin walls, and I listened, each word carving deeper wounds into me. Lily spoke of me not as a father to be respected, but as an obstacle, a man so outdated in his ways that he smothered her with rules and routines she claimed she no longer needed. "He doesn't get it," she said with a scoff, and her friends giggled, encouraging her cruelty. "He acts like it's still 20 years ago. No privacy, always asking questions, always hovering like I can't make my own choices. He's so boring. Sometimes I just want to leave this house and never come back." Their laughter echoed like thunder in my ears, and I pressed my hand against the wall, steadying myself from the nausea that rose within me. Each phrase revealed the truth. She had been venting about me often, building an image of me as a prison guard instead of a father, mocking my values as if love and care were crimes against her independence. They nodded in agreement as she painted me as the villain in her story. And I realized then that to her friends, I was not a man who had sacrificed everything for his daughter, but a caricature, a punchline in her jokes, the symbol of everything she wanted to escape. In their laughter, I felt stripped of dignity, reduced to a shadow of the man I thought I was. My traditions, my insistence on family meals together, my belief in boundaries and discipline, all of it ridiculed as old-fashioned and suffocating. I understood that in her quest for acceptance among her peers, she had cast me in the role of an enemy, using me to make herself appear bold, rebellious, independent. But what hurt most was not the performance, it was the conviction in her voice, the sincerity of her disdain. She did not defend me. She did not balance her complaints with acknowledgement of my love. She simply fed their amusement with every bitter exaggeration. That night, as her friends left the house still laughing, I stood at the window and watched them disappear into the dark street, their shadows long under the lamplight. My chest felt hollow, my spirit emptied. My daughter's circle had become her audience, and I was the joke she told to earn their applause. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind churned with the venom of her words, and though a storm of anger pressed against my chest, I chose not to release it in shouting or confrontation. I realized then that yelling at her, demanding apologies, or punishing her in the ways I once had when she was younger would do nothing but deepen her resentment. She would see me as the tyrant she already painted me to be, and my voice would only confirm her narrative to her friends. No, if I wanted her to understand the weight of respect, I would not do it with noise. I would do it with silence and action. I told myself that lessons learned in silence carve themselves deeper into the soul, and I resolved that I would no longer shield her from the consequences of her ingratitude. She believed I was boring, predictable, a background character in her life, so I would step into that background not with weakness but with intent, stripping away the invisible safety net she had always taken for granted. I thought of the countless times I had rescued her from embarrassment, from the sting of disappointment, and I realized it was my interventions that had made her blind to my worth. From this point on, I decided there would be no more easy rescues. The money I quietly slipped into her purse, the favors I bent over backwards to grant, the excuses I offered on her behalf, those would end. I would not confront her with words that would fly in one ear and out the other. Instead, I would let her own careless words shape the reality she so desired. If she believed I was boring, then I would bore myself right out of her world by withdrawing the constant, unappreciated effort that had propped up her comfort. The silence I kept in my heart that night felt heavy, like a blade held steady before a strike, not meant to harm but to teach. In that silence, I began to build a plan, a vow not to shout or rage but to step back and let her collide with the truths she had mocked. She wanted freedom. She wanted privacy. She wanted to see me as unnecessary. Very well. I would grant her the space to discover exactly what my presence had meant all along. As I closed my eyes at last, my heart still bruised and aching, I whispered to myself a promise. She will learn, not through lectures, not through arguments. She will learn through absence, through the quiet retreat of a father who has carried the weight of her world for too long without gratitude. And when she feels the ground tremble beneath her, without me holding it steady, only then will she understand the value of respect. The next morning, I began the subtle work of withdrawing my support, each action deliberate, measured, designed not to punish in anger, but to let consequences speak louder than words ever could. I stopped driving Lily to school, letting her walk the streets she had once taken for granted, knowing that without my presence, she would feel the small but accumulating friction of responsibility. The pocket money I had always slipped into her hand without question was withheld, replaced with a quiet expectation that she manage her own needs and face the choices she had long evaded. Where I had once intercepted mistakes before they reached teachers, friends, or strangers, I now allowed her errors to stand exposed, unedited, and undeniable. I did not gloat or express a single word of disappointment. I simply stepped back and watched as the vacuum created by my absence forced her to confront the world she had assumed would bend endlessly to her whims. The small acts of independence I denied her in the past, losing a book, missing an assignment, forgetting a lunch item, now hit harder because she had grown accustomed to my intervention, my cushioning of every misstep. When she asked for a ride, I did not argue, I did not justify, I merely said that she needed to find another way, and in the silence of my refusal, she understood that the safety net had vanished. The same went for errands, for requests for money to buy snacks, for excuses she had always expected me to fabricate on her behalf. Each one I now denied with quiet finality. It was not cruelty, though it might have felt like it to her. It was education, the kind of lesson that could not be learned in lectures or heated words. I watched her navigate her day with mounting frustration, each inconvenience a thread unraveling the tapestry of entitlement she had woven so carefully. At first, she complained, whining in a voice that assumed she could still bend me to her will, and I simply nodded in silence, allowing her to vent, to expend her energy on words that had no effect. Then came the realization, the subtle, creeping recognition that life was not a series of effortless concessions granted by a man she had called boring, that each choice had consequences she could no longer ignore. Her friends' laughter no longer softened the blow because the scaffolding I had always provided was gone, and she could feel it in the weight of her empty hands, in the strain of her legs as she walked further than she ever had, in the tightening knot of frustration that grew with every delayed response, every task left undone. I remained calm, silent, steadfast, a quiet presence that no longer intervened, and in that silence, I began to see the first glimmers of awareness form in her eyes, the beginning of the lesson I had long hoped she would learn, that respect is not demanded, it is earned through the acknowledgement of what one has been given. Lily returned home that afternoon expecting the usual welcome, the easy warmth that had always awaited her in the living room, but instead, she was met with the quiet absence of attention, the deliberate coldness that now seemed to hang around me like a shadow she could not dispel. She paused in the doorway, noticing the way I did not glance up from the newspaper, the way I did not rise to greet her with the habitual smile or question about her day. At first, she assumed it was a temporary mood, a minor irritation that would pass in minutes, and she dropped her bag with a casual thud, expecting the familiar reassurance that everything would continue as usual. But as the hours passed, she noticed the small, deliberate ways in which my engagement had withdrawn the text messages she sent, went unanswered longer than usual, the questions she asked met with silence or a nod, and the offers she had come to expect were quietly absent. She sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, throwing glances at me, convinced that I would soon return to my normal self because I always did, because that had been the pattern of our lives, a rhythm she had come to rely on without thinking. She joked with a friend on a video call about my sudden mood swings and laughed at the idea, believing it would irritate me and that the irritation would dissolve as quickly as it appeared, as it always had. Yet beneath her laughter, an uneasy awareness began to prick at her mind, small and persistent, that perhaps this time was different. She noticed that I did not rise when she called for help, did not fetch the snacks she had long taken for granted, did not make excuses or smooth over any inconvenience that touched her day. The air that had once felt protective now felt distant, almost cold, and though she tried to dismiss it, her stomach twisted at the unfamiliar tension. Her friends teased her, saying he is probably just tired, that he will be back to his old self tomorrow, and she nodded with the practiced ease of one who wanted reassurance. But inside, the first seeds of doubt had been planted. Lily began to realize that the man she had always considered predictable and indulgent was no longer responding to her whims in the familiar patterns she had studied and exploited. She felt the subtle but undeniable shift, the weight of expectation and consequence pressing against her without the comforting cushion she had always counted on. Yet stubbornly, she brushed it off, pretending to herself and to her friends that it was temporary, that he would get over it, that she could return to her life without adjusting to the new rules that had quietly begun to govern the household. Still, a small, nagging anxiety followed her through the day, a whisper she could not silence that this was no ordinary withdrawal, and that the father she had mocked as boring was quietly teaching her a lesson she had not yet understood. My wife noticed the tension almost immediately, the way the house seemed quieter yet heavier, how Lily moved through the rooms with a restless energy that betrayed both irritation and unease. She approached me in the kitchen while I rinsed a glass at the sink, her hand brushing lightly against my arm, a silent plea for explanation. "Daniel, something is wrong," she said softly, her eyes searching mine for answers I was not ready to give. "Lily seems off. You're distant. She's complaining more than usual, and I can feel the walls between you two." I turned slowly to her, letting the weight of my gaze meet hers, and in that moment I realized she expected discussion, debate, perhaps even reconciliation. But I had resolved long ago that this lesson could not be rushed, could not be softened by excuses or gentle words. I placed the glass on the counter with a careful clink and met her eyes calmly. "She'll learn in time," I said quietly, letting the words hang in the air, steady and immovable. My wife frowned, a mixture of concern and frustration crossing her face. "Daniel, I understand you want to teach her respect, but is coldness really the way? She's still a child. Won't she resent you forever?" I shook my head gently, more to settle my own thoughts than to persuade her. Resentment fades. Lessons endured in silence are remembered. She will understand what she has taken for granted. She looked at me with a questioning stare, her lips pressed together as though she wanted to argue but could not find the words to counter the quiet conviction in my tone. I did not offer further justification, nor did I try to soften the blow of my resolve. I knew her instincts, as nurturing as they were, longed to protect our daughter from the discomfort of consequence. But I had seen the way indulgence had bred carelessness, the way constant rescue had created entitlement. This had to be different. I placed my hands on the counter, leaning slightly, the light catching the lines of fatigue and determination on my face. "She will understand," I repeated, slower this time, letting the finality of the phrase settle. "I have given her every opportunity to see the value of respect and responsibility. Now it is time for her to confront the absence of the easy life she has always known. She will learn the weight of what she has dismissed. My wife exhaled softly, a mix of worry and reluctant acknowledgement, and although she did not entirely agree, she sensed that my resolve was unshakable. She stepped back, placing her hand briefly on my shoulder before withdrawing, the unspoken acknowledgement that this lesson, as harsh as it might feel to her maternal instincts, was necessary. The house seemed to shift slightly in the quiet aftermath of our conversation, a tension threading the air that neither of us spoke aloud, a prelude to the reckoning that was quietly building for Lily, a reckoning she had yet to recognize, but would soon be unable to ignore. Lily's friends became her constant chorus, reinforcing the narrative she had already begun to tell herself, that her father was boring, overbearing, and unnecessary in her life. Each time they gathered, whether in her room or on video calls, they urged her to see him as an obstacle rather than a protector, laughing at the idea that she should respect his rules or heed his advice. "Why do you even listen to him?" one friend said, giggling as Lily nodded, eager to feel validated. "You don't need him telling you what to do. You can make your own decisions. He's so controlling it's embarrassing." Another chimed in, suggesting she assert her independence by ignoring his instructions, spending her money how she pleased, and doing things without asking for approval, as though a single act of defiance would earn her instant liberation. Encouraged by their approval, Lily began testing the limits, skipping the reminders he had always offered, refusing to ask for help with errands, and brushing off requests that she participate in family routines. For a brief moment, she felt exhilarated, convinced that she was finally free, that she had broken away from the boring man she had mocked. But the first cracks appeared almost immediately. Missing the bus one morning forced her to walk a longer route in the rain, soaking her clothes and making her late for school. The small allowance she had taken for granted no longer arrived, leaving her scrambling for lunch money she had never had to manage on her own. Assignments that she had once been reminded about were suddenly late, and teachers questioned her accountability for the first time, leaving her anxious and flustered. Even her friends' laughter began to feel hollow, as she realized that freedom came with burdens she had never anticipated, that autonomy without preparation was heavier than she imagined. She stumbled over the small but cumulative inconveniences, the little crises her father had always quietly prevented, and for the first time she felt the absence of the man she had dismissed as boring. Their advice, once intoxicating in its simplicity, now seemed reckless. Each day added a layer of frustration and embarrassment that she had no strategy to handle, a growing awareness that her father's rules and guidance had been less about control and more about care. The thrill of independence was replaced by the weight of responsibility she had never shouldered before, and the confidence she had felt with her friends' support began to falter. She caught herself longing for the simplicity of a life where someone silently ensured her mistakes didn't cascade into consequences she could not manage, where she could laugh without fearing the small disasters that now followed her every decision. The influence of her friends had emboldened her to rebel, but the reality of living without her father's constant, quiet interventions was proving far more difficult than she had imagined, and for the first time, the word boring seemed almost synonymous with necessary, with stability she had failed to appreciate until it was withdrawn. The consequences of my withdrawal came swiftly and silently, and Lily began to encounter the real weight of independence she had so eagerly chased. The first blow came when she missed the school trip she had been looking forward to for months, a carefully planned excursion that had required early registration and timely payment details she had always relied on me to manage. This time, I did nothing to remind her, and she arrived too late to secure her spot, standing in the hallway as her classmates boarded the bus, their excitement amplifying her humiliation. She watched through the glass as friends waved from the windows, and the realization hit her hard. Her father's absence in planning and support meant tangible loss, a direct result of the very freedom she had demanded. Next came the missing allowance, the small yet essential lifeline she had always taken for granted. Coins that had once appeared in her wallet without thought now remained absent, forcing her to confront the frustration of scraping together her own meager funds for snacks, books, and small pleasures. Every purchase she attempted was a lesson in planning, budgeting, and prioritizing skills she had never learned because I had long provided them for her. And as if these small humiliations were not enough, the ripple effect reached her social life, exposing her to the sharp judgment of peers who once admired her carefree confidence. Friends questioned why she had no money, why she had missed the trip, why she seemed flustered and unprepared. Their laughter, previously a source of camaraderie, now stung with the bitter taste of embarrassment. I watched silently from the kitchen window as she attempted to explain herself, her words fumbling and defensive, her usual assurance replaced by awkward gestures and lowered eyes. There was no shouting from me, no overt scolding, just the quiet, immovable consequence of actions she had long ignored. Each moment of discomfort, each pang of embarrassment reinforced the lesson I had set in motion, that freedom without responsibility was not liberation, but exposure to failure. Her pride suffered, her entitlement began to fray, and she could no longer dismiss the value of the support she had once derided. I remained a silent observer, my heart heavy but resolute, knowing that these small, cumulative consequences were the instruments of understanding. The missed trip, the absent allowance, and the social discomfort, they were all part of a carefully orchestrated reality in which she would have to reconcile her disdain for me with the essential role I had always played in her life. In this quiet way, I began to see cracks form in her confidence, the beginnings of reflection that would one day lead to recognition, remorse, and the appreciation she had so far refused to offer. The next test arrived during a family gathering, a casual reunion where relatives filled the room with laughter, chatter, and the aroma of home-cooked food. And Lily, emboldened by her friend's earlier encouragement, began once again to voice her grievances. She leaned against the dining table, her tone sharp and playful as she complained to cousins about how boring and controlling she found me, how little privacy she had, and how she felt stifled in her own home. At first, the conversation drew nods and smiles from a few younger relatives who had grown accustomed to her lively personality, and for a fleeting moment she seemed triumphant, certain that her voice carried weight and sympathy. But then came the quiet, yet powerful corrections from those who knew her story, from aunts and uncles who had watched me labor for decades, who had seen the countless nights I had worked tirelessly to ensure my family lacked for nothing. One uncle, who had always been straightforward, looked at her calmly and said, "Lily, you should remember how much your father has sacrificed for you. Do you really think life has been easy for him?" The words struck her like a cold splash of water. Another aunt nodded, recounting small but significant examples, how I had worked overtime to pay for piano lessons, stayed late to help her with homework, and ensured her room was warm and welcoming while I often went without. The laughter that had accompanied her complaints faded, replaced by awkward glances and silence that weighed heavily on her. Her friends were not present, and the room's collective memory of my dedication contrasted sharply with her narrative, exposing the exaggeration in her complaints. Her cheeks flushed, and for the first time, she hesitated mid-sentence, unsure how to respond to the quiet but undeniable acknowledgement of my efforts. Each reminder from family members, each story of sacrifice, each mention of the hours I had given to secure her comfort cut through her bravado, leaving her exposed and embarrassed in a way I had not engineered but that emerged naturally from her own misplaced judgments. She struggled to defend herself, fumbling with words that had sounded so confident earlier, realizing too late that the audience she had expected to validate her insults now reminded her of the truth she had ignored. I sat quietly across the room, observing without comment, letting the gentle authority of reality unfold around her, a lesson far more potent than any lecture I could have given. The sting of public embarrassment sank in slowly, teaching her that words have consequences, that respect is grounded in awareness of others' sacrifices, and that the life she had once dismissed as boring was in fact built entirely upon the unseen labor of a father who had loved her beyond measure. For the first time, a creeping sense of guilt began to pierce through Lily's carefully constructed pride, a slow, insidious realization that the life she had long taken for granted was not simply the result of luck or convenience, but the outcome of countless silent sacrifices her father had made. She sat on her bed that night, staring at the ceiling with a restless, troubled expression, replaying in her mind the quiet ways he had supported her without fanfare or complaint. She remembered the early mornings when breakfast was always waiting, the nights when her homework was reviewed with patience even though he had just returned from long, exhausting shifts, the times he had driven her to countless activities she had begged for without ever hesitating or asking for compensation. Each memory was a revelation, an undeniable fact that she could no longer ignore. Her fingers traced the edge of the desk as her thoughts tumbled, realizing how often she had complained about being bored or suffocated while he had been working quietly behind the scenes to make sure she had opportunities she could scarcely imagine. The missed allowances, the forgotten reminders, the piano lessons, the rides, the meals, the attention, everything that had felt ordinary, everything she had dismissed as his duty, now appeared in sharp relief as acts of devotion, acts that demanded gratitude rather than disdain. She thought of the long hours he had endured, the friendships he had set aside, the personal pleasures he had delayed, all so she could live with comfort and ease. The realization came like a slow burning fire, warming her chest with shame and igniting the first flicker of understanding that she had been blind to his efforts for far too long. She remembered the faces of her relatives at the recent gathering, the gentle reminders and stories that had punctured her arrogance, and she began to see the truth in their words. The humor of her complaints, now bitter against the backdrop of reality. Her friends' teasing, once intoxicating, now seemed hollow, their advice reckless, their encouragement misguided. She felt the weight of the choices she had made in defiance, the arrogance of assuming that independence meant shirking acknowledgement of the man who had built the foundation beneath her feet. Guilt coiled in her stomach, a knot of unease that made her restless and sleepless, and for the first time she questioned not only her attitude but her understanding of love, respect, and responsibility. Every detail she had once ignored now demanded recognition. Every silent act of care her father had provided whispered insistently in her mind, "You have been blind, and now you must see." The pride she had clung to so stubbornly wavered under the weight of this truth, and she found herself unable to dismiss the quiet, invisible work of a father who had given everything without expectation of reward, a realization that marked the beginning of a transformation she had resisted until that moment. The breaking point arrived on a bright Saturday afternoon when Lily joined her friends for a casual outing, expecting the usual comfort of having her needs quietly met by her father's steady support. She had assumed her allowance would be waiting in her wallet, that any forgotten item or unplanned expense could be covered with a quick call home. But for the first time, those safety nets were gone. As they arrived at the cafe, she pulled out her purse, only to find it empty, the coins and bills she had always relied on absent, replaced by the stark reality that she had to account for her own spending. Panic set in as she realized she could not pay for her share of the drinks or snacks they had ordered, the balance glaring back at her like an accusation. Her friends noticed immediately, their teasing laughter rising, casual but sharp, slicing through her confidence. "Seriously? You don't even have enough for your own latte?" One friend snickered, and another added, "Wow, I guess someone's daddy doesn't cover everything for you anymore." The ridicule grew, punctuated by jokes that once would have bounced off her carefree pride, but now struck deep, exposing her dependence in front of peers she had long wanted to impress. Lily's face flushed crimson, her heart pounding with embarrassment and disbelief as she fumbled with her wallet, trying to conjure a solution that didn't exist. She felt the eyes of the cafe on her, the casual judgment in every glance, and the weight of humiliation pressed down in a way she had never experienced before. She had always assumed her father's support was unending, a guarantee that mistakes would be smoothed over and shortfalls quietly remedied, but now she faced the raw consequences of independence she had demanded. The laughter of her friends, once comforting in its affirmation, now became a mirror, reflecting her unpreparedness, her reliance on a man she had scorned as boring and controlling. Each joke, each smirk, each pointed comment cut deeper than any lecture, more effective than any argument, for it forced her to confront the reality she had refused to see. Life, without her father's quiet interventions, was harsher, sharper, and far more challenging than she had anticipated. She tried to laugh along, forcing a joke to mask her discomfort, but it fell flat, a fragile shield against the sting of social embarrassment. In that moment, as coins clinked in her friend's hands and the barista waited patiently but firmly, Lily understood with piercing clarity that her father's presence had been more than a nuisance or a set of rules. It had been a foundation that supported her every choice, a protection she had not appreciated until it was removed. The outing, meant to be a light-hearted escape, became a crucible of awareness, and the laughter of her friends transformed from playful camaraderie to a harsh teacher, driving home the lesson she had been avoiding. That freedom without responsibility carried consequences she could no longer ignore, and that the man she had mocked as boring had quietly shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Lily returned home that evening with tear-streaked cheeks, her small sobs echoing through the quiet house as she pushed the door closed behind her. The cafe outing had been more humiliating than she could have imagined, each laugh and whispered comment from her friends replaying in her mind like a relentless drumbeat, reminding her of her dependence and her ignorance. She had prided herself on independence, on rejecting her father's boring rules, but now the weight of reality pressed down on her, crushing her pride and leaving her raw with shame. She wandered into the living room, dropping onto the couch as tears fell freely, the quiet sound of her crying filling the space that had once felt safe and ordinary. For the first time, she truly saw what she had dismissed all these years. The constant, patient support he had provided, the invisible scaffolding that had kept her life steady, while she flitted carelessly through it. She thought of the mornings when breakfast had always been ready, of the lunches he packed without comment, of the rides he gave her even when he had long days at work and aching muscles. She remembered the countless times he had smoothed over mistakes she had made at school, rescued her from embarrassment, and ensured her comforts were maintained, all while asking nothing in return. Her sobs grew louder as the realization sank in. The man she had labeled boring, the man she had mocked to her friends, the man she had seen as an obstacle to freedom, had been her greatest support, the quiet hero of every moment she had ever taken for granted. She could feel the guilt twisting inside her chest, a heavy knot that made her heart ache, and she pressed her hands to her face, wishing she could erase the carelessness of her words, the arrogance of her complaints, and the blindness she had carried for so long. She wanted to call out to him, to apologize, to beg him to forgive the disdain she had shown, but the fear of his silence held her in place, the uncertainty of whether he would respond gently or sternly, only intensifying the torment she felt. For the first time, she recognized that his presence, once considered dull and overbearing, had been the quiet engine behind the life she had always enjoyed, and without it, the fragility of her existence became painfully clear. The tears that flowed were not only for the embarrassment she had endured, but for the harsh truth she could no longer deny. She had misjudged the one person who had given everything for her without complaint, who had silently sacrificed his own comfort, dreams, and time to ensure her life was full, safe, and happy. And in those tears, mingled with shame and regret, a seed of understanding took root, the first fragile stirrings of gratitude and awareness that she had long resisted, and a hope, however tentative, that she could begin to make amends for the years she had dismissed and the words she had spoken so carelessly. Lily wiped her tears on the sleeve of her shirt and approached Daniel cautiously, her steps hesitant, as though afraid of the silence that had grown between them like a tangible wall. She had expected comfort, a gentle embrace, maybe a soft word that would soothe her guilt and reassure her that all was forgiven. But as she neared him sitting quietly in the living room, she realized he remained calm, distant, a steady presence untouched by the storm of her emotions. Her voice trembled as she spoke, the words spilling out in a rush. I didn't mean it. I've been so selfish. I'm sorry for everything I said. Please, can you forgive me?" She looked up, hoping for warmth, a flicker of the affection that had once felt automatic in his responses, but his expression remained controlled, measured, almost solemn, and the weight of his gaze pressed down on her with a gravity she had not anticipated. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate, carrying the quiet authority that had always underpinned his presence. "Respect is not a right, it is earned." The words struck her harder than any punishment could have, their truth piercing through the layers of defensiveness she had clung to for so long. He continued, his tone steady but firm. "It is not given automatically because someone provides for you or loves you. It must be shown through understanding, acknowledgement, and the willingness to recognize the value of those who care for you. Lily's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she listened, realizing that her father's calm distance was not coldness, but a deliberate tool, a way to make her confront the reality she had evaded. She had expected immediate absolution, a soothing balm to erase the sting of her embarrassment and guilt, but instead, she was faced with a principle she could not negotiate or argue away. Her previous notions of independence, of freedom without consequence, crumbled as she understood that her behavior had consequences beyond immediate comfort or indulgence. She felt the weight of her actions settle upon her, a tangible heaviness in her chest, and tears returned, slower this time, more reflective, mingled with the first real understanding of the man she had mocked. Daniel's eyes softened slightly as he observed her, but he did not offer the consolation she had sought. He waited, letting the silence stretch, allowing her to feel the responsibility and remorse that had been absent in her previous arrogance. She nodded slowly, words failing her, and in that silence, she absorbed the lesson he had imparted not through lectures, not through punishment, but through steady, unyielding expectation and the quiet demonstration of what true respect required. In that moment, she realized that forgiveness and understanding were not gifts freely given. They were earned through recognition, humility, and the acknowledgement of sacrifice, a truth that would stay with her far longer than the fleeting satisfaction of defiance ever had. Lily sank to her knees before Daniel, her shoulders trembling, her voice raw as she poured out the apology she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind, but never spoken aloud with this kind of sincerity. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I didn't understand, and I didn't appreciate everything you've done for me. I was selfish, and I said terrible things. Please forgive me." Her hands clasped together as though pleading, her eyes shining with tears that refused to stop. But when she looked up at him, expecting the relief of immediate forgiveness, she found only calm, unwavering composure. Daniel's expression remained measured, his posture relaxed yet unyielding, and in that quiet stillness, the weight of her own words pressed down harder than ever. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady, carrying the deliberate cadence of someone who had witnessed betrayal and disappointment before. "Lily, I hear your apology, and I know your heart is in it," he said, "but words alone cannot undo the pain they cause. Words leave scars, whether we mean them or not." The honesty in his tone struck her more deeply than any punishment could have. She felt the ache of her recklessness, the magnitude of the casual contempt she had flung at the one person who had always carried her without complaint. I understand," she whispered, her throat tight, struggling to breathe through the remorse and shame. "I never meant to hurt you, I thought." But her words faltered as she realized there was no escape, no excuse sufficient to erase the impact of her betrayal. Daniel did not lecture further, did not scold or raise his voice. He simply held her gaze, a quiet reminder of the principle he had lived by: respect and trust. Once broken, required time and consistent acknowledgement to heal. Lily's hands fell to her lap, the desperation of her apology mingling with an acute awareness of the damage her thoughtless words had caused, and she understood that forgiveness was not an immediate balm, but a journey that demanded effort, patience, and the rebuilding of trust she had so carelessly eroded. The room was silent except for her quiet sobs, the unspoken weight of the lesson settling between them, teaching her that love alone did not erase the consequences of disrespect, that even the deepest bonds could bear the scars of thoughtlessness, and that earning back a father's respect required far more than tears and words. It required understanding, humility, and the slow, deliberate actions of someone truly remorseful. In the weeks that followed, a subtle transformation began to take shape in Lily, one that was as quiet and deliberate as the lessons she had been forced to confront. At first, it was small gestures. She started helping around the house without being asked, folding laundry and putting dishes away, tasks she had long dismissed as tedious and beneath her attention. The change was cautious at first, her movements careful, almost tentative, as though testing whether her efforts would be acknowledged or dismissed. But as the days passed, these small acts grew more consistent, more intentional, a silent acknowledgement of the support she had once scorned. Schoolwork, which had previously been neglected or completed with minimal effort, suddenly demanded her focus and energy. She studied diligently, organizing her assignments, taking notes carefully, and even asking questions when she struggled, demonstrating a newfound respect for the process of learning and for the sacrifices her father had made to provide these opportunities. Her attitude toward Daniel began to shift in subtle ways as well. She greeted him with warmth rather than indifference, included him in small conversations, and sought his advice, no longer assuming his guidance was a constraint, but recognizing it as a resource she had previously undervalued. She began to express gratitude for things that had once seemed ordinary: a hot meal, a ride to school, a quiet evening spent together, and her acknowledgments, though simple, carried weight, signaling the emergence of genuine appreciation. The atmosphere in the house changed too. The tension that had hung like a thick fog gradually lifted, replaced by a mutual understanding that had been earned rather than demanded. Daniel observed her quietly, noting the consistency of her efforts, the sincerity of her words, and the careful attention she now gave to responsibilities she had once ignored. He did not shower her with immediate praise, but allowed her actions to speak for themselves, letting her own recognition of her growth serve as the true reward. Slowly, the bond between father and daughter deepened, strengthened not by lectures or punishment, but by the conscious choices Lily made to honor the love, patience, and sacrifices she had once disregarded. She learned to anticipate needs without being asked, to consider the consequences of her actions, and to show respect not out of obligation, but from an understanding of the value of the man who had always been her steadfast anchor. In these gradual, consistent changes, Daniel saw the proof that lessons delivered in silence and action could leave an indelible mark, that respect once lost could be reclaimed through effort and reflection, and that the love between parent and child, when nurtured by understanding and accountability, could emerge stronger than ever before. Each day became a quiet testament to redemption, to the resilience of bonds once strained, and to the transformative power of responsibility, gratitude, and deliberate choice. It was late one evening when Daniel finally addressed Lily with a quiet, steady presence that had once seemed unreachable to her, a moment she had both anticipated and feared. She approached him cautiously, aware of the tension that had defined their relationship for so long, and yet buoyed by the sincere changes she had worked to cultivate in herself. Daniel looked at her, the lines of worry and patience etched into his face, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed a small, approving smile to flicker across his features. "Lily," he began, his voice calm but layered with the weight of experience and understanding, "I've watched you change, and I see the effort you've put into your actions, your responsibilities, and your attitude. She swallowed, a lump forming in her throat, knowing that this acknowledgment carried more significance than any praise or shallow approval ever could. He continued, "I can forgive you, and I do. But forgiveness does not erase the past, nor does it instantly restore what has been damaged. Trust is built over time, and it must be proven through consistency, respect, and understanding." His words were firm but not cold, a balance that made Lily realize the gravity of what had been lost and the value of what she was now earning. She nodded, tears threatening but held back by a newfound maturity, and whispered, "I understand, Dad. I will keep showing you that I've learned. I won't take your love or sacrifices for granted again." Daniel's eyes softened as he absorbed her sincerity, but he remained steadfast in his principle, demonstrating that, while love and forgiveness could be offered, trust required action and commitment to fully restore. He extended his hand, not as a symbol of absolution, but as an invitation to rebuild, to continue proving through deeds rather than words that she deserved the confidence and reliance he had once offered without question. Lily grasped his hand, feeling the quiet strength behind the gesture, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of equilibrium in their relationship, a delicate balance of acknowledgement, accountability, and renewed connection. In that moment, the house, once heavy with unspoken disappointment and strained interactions, seemed to breathe with relief, carrying the subtle warmth of mutual respect slowly being restored. The lesson was complete not through punishment nor through humiliation alone, but through the patient observation, silent guidance, and careful withdrawal of support that had compelled Lily to confront her own arrogance and lack of appreciation. Daniel's forgiveness was not a simple pardon. It was a measured recognition of change. A doorway opened cautiously, but sincerely, to a future built on trust, respect, and the understanding that love, though abundant, requires acknowledgement and effort to be fully honored. The quiet of the evening settled around them, a shared moment of reflection and commitment, signaling the beginning of a renewed bond strengthened by trials endured, lessons learned, and the deliberate cultivation of gratitude and respect. In the weeks and months that followed, Lily's appreciation for her father deepened, quietly but profoundly, as the lessons he had imparted settled into her heart. She began to notice the subtle ways he continued to care for the household, the unnoticed sacrifices that had always surrounded her life like a protective shield. Mornings that were once taken for granted, breakfasts prepared without complaint, gentle reminders for school, the quiet organization of her day now appeared to her as acts of devotion she could no longer overlook. She reflected on the freedom she had once demanded, the privacy she had clamored for, and realized that these things, though precious, were meaningless without respect and gratitude for the man who had built the foundation beneath her feet. Every opportunity she had enjoyed, every comfort she had assumed as natural, had been the result of his unwavering commitment and silent labor. The lessons of responsibility, accountability, and consideration for others crystallized in her mind not as abstract principles, but as living truths evidenced in his actions and her own experiences. She began to anticipate his needs, to contribute willingly to the household, to speak with kindness and acknowledgement, and to express gratitude not as a forced courtesy, but as a heartfelt recognition of the life he had given her. Even in moments of privacy, she no longer saw it as an entitlement, but as a space he had respected and protected, a privilege that came from mutual understanding rather than unilateral freedom. Their conversations became richer, layered with the intimacy that only genuine appreciation could bring, and she found herself cherishing the routines and traditions she had once scorned as boring. The subtle, deliberate structure of her father's life, once dismissed as restrictive, now struck her as the very architecture that allowed her world to function smoothly, safely, and with comfort she had rarely acknowledged. In her heart, she carried a quiet vow to honor the sacrifices he had made, to treat his love with the reverence it deserved, and to ensure that her words and actions reflected the respect she had once failed to show. The household, once strained by unspoken resentment and misunderstood intentions, now resonated with a newfound harmony, built upon recognition, gratitude, and the balance between independence and accountability. And in the stillness of a quiet evening, watching her father move through the living room with the calm authority that had shaped her life, Lily understood fully for the first time that privacy, freedom, and choice held true meaning only when accompanied by respect for the one who had made those privileges possible. The final lesson settled deep within her. Love and care are not merely shields to hide behind or rules to rebel against, but the very essence of a life worth honoring, and gratitude is the bridge that connects freedom to understanding, transforming ordinary routines into extraordinary bonds. In that realization, she smiled softly to herself, a sense of profound appreciation swelling in her chest, knowing that the boring father she had once ridiculed was, in truth, the most vital, steadfast presence in her life, and that her awareness and respect would ensure that his sacrifices were never again taken for granted. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.